You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In January of 1801, Ireland joined the United Kingdom through the Acts of Union. The top officials for Ireland, the Lord Lieutenant and the Chief Secretary, were chosen by the British government. Ireland had 105 representatives in the UK's House of Commons and 28 Irish lords who were elected to serve for life in the House of Lords. From 1832 to 1859, most of the Irish representatives, about 70%, were landowners or their children. For the next 40 years, British officials faced the challenge of managing Ireland, which had significant issues. In 1844, Benjamin Disraeli highlighted these issues, describing Ireland as having a hungry population, landlords who lived elsewhere, a Protestant church that was foreign to most Irish people, and a weak government. One historian found that between 1800 and 1845, there were 114 different commissions and 61 special committees, all trying to understand Ireland's problems. Their reports unanimously predicted dire outcomes, painting a picture of a country on the brink of disaster, widespread hunger, a booming yet underemployed population, terrible housing, and extremely low living standards. John Hughes, the Bishop of New York, gave lectures in 1847 that delve into the factors leading up to the Irish famine, with a particular focus on the political environment at the time. These lectures provide a contemporary look at the circumstances that contributed to the famine's occurrence. Back in the 18th century, the way land and property were managed took a new turn with the implementation of the middleman system. This basically meant that landlords handed off the job of collecting rent to agents, known as middlemen, ensuring themselves a steady flow of cash without having to deal directly with the tenants. Unfortunately, this left room for middlemen to exploit tenants, since their main goal was to squeeze out as much rent as they could. They would lease large areas of land from the landlords under long-term agreements with set rents, and then sublet these lands to tenants. Any extra rent they got above what they owed the landlords, they kept to themselves. This led to harsh exploitation, with middlemen dividing the land into smaller sections to extract more rent and evicting tenants for various reasons like failing to pay these inflated rents, or if a landlord decided to switch from growing crops to raising sheep. Tenants, who were cottiers, paid their rent by working for the landlord, while spalpeens, or itinerant labourers, paid through temporary work. The social structure of the time was stark, with about 80% of the Catholic majority living in tough conditions of poverty and uncertainty. The top of the social pyramid was the ascendancy class, mainly English and Anglo-Irish families who owned the majority of the land and had nearly total control over their tenants. Some owned vast estates, like the Earl of Lucan, who had more than 60,000 acres. Many of these landlords lived in England and rarely visited Ireland, pumping the rent revenue collected from tenants labouring for minimal wages out of Ireland and into England. In 1800, the first Earl of Clare bluntly noted that landlords saw confiscation as their birthright. Historian Cecil Woodham Smith pointed out that landlords viewed the land primarily as a means to generate income, often overlooking the harsh realities and suffering of the tenants who silently endured their hardships. By 1842, it was estimated that about £6 million were being sent out of Ireland by these absentee landlords, highlighting a severe economic drain. Acknowledging the deep-rooted issues in Ireland's land management system, the British government, by 1843, pinpointed it as the core cause of widespread dissatisfaction in the country. They formed the Devon Commission, led by the Earl of Devon, to look into land occupation laws, although Irish politician Daniel O'Connell criticised the commission for being biased, packed with landlords and no tenant voices. The Devon Commission reported in 1845 the severe hardships faced by the Irish labourers, surviving mainly on potatoes, drinking only water, living in shabby cabins barely sheltering them from the weather, and owning very little, perhaps just a pig, and a manure heap. The Commission was impressed by the tenants' endurance despite their significant sufferings, and stressed that poor relations between landlords and tenants were a primary cause of this distress. Tenants, described as victims of land sharks and bloodsuckers, had little incentive to improve their holdings since any enhancements would ultimately become the landlord's property. Ulster stood out as an exception where the tenant right allowed tenants compensation for any improvements they made, leading to a more prosperous and peaceful situation compared to the rest of Ireland. This disparity underscored how the misuse of power by landlords discouraged innovation and contributed to creating a stricken peasantry among the poorest in Europe. Ireland experienced a dramatic increase in its population, soaring from approximately 2 million people in 1700 to 8 million by the onset of the Great Famine. This population boom led to land being divided into ever smaller portions. By 1845, nearly a quarter of Irish tenant farms were incredibly small, ranging from 1 to 5 acres, and 40% of them were only slightly larger, spanning 5 to 15 acres. These tiny plots of land meant that growing potatoes was pretty much the only option for feeding a family, as no other crop could produce enough food on such limited acreage. Just before the famine struck, the British government had pointed out the dire economic conditions, noting that 1/3 of Irish small farms couldn't even sustain their tenant families after paying rent. These families stayed afloat financially only by taking seasonal work in England and Scotland. After the famine, laws were introduced to prevent the further subdivision of land, aiming to address at least some of the underlying issues. The 1841 census recorded Ireland's population at just over 8 million, with 2/3 of these people relying on agriculture for their livelihood. However, they didn't earn a wage from this work. Instead, they worked for landlords in exchange for a small piece of land where they could grow their own food. This arrangement forced Irish farmers into a corner where they had to solely rely on potatoes, as this was the only crop viable enough to meet their nutritional needs under such constraints. The potato first arrived in Ireland as something the wealthy planted in their gardens. However, by the late 1600s, it had become a common addition to the Irish diet, which was primarily based on items like butter, milk, and grains. Between 1760 and 1815, Ireland's economy saw significant growth, partly due to the building of infrastructure and partly because the Napoleonic Wars from 1805 to 1815 increased Britain's demand for food. This led to a boom in farming, but also meant that small farmers had very little land left to grow their own food. The potato, able to be grown quickly in tight spaces, became a key food source, and by 1800 was the main food for 1 out of every 3 Irish people, especially during the winter months. Over time, it became a year-round staple for farmers. Unfortunately, a lot of the potatoes grown were of the Irish lumper variety, which lacked genetic diversity, making them all the more susceptible to diseases. The potato was crucial for the development of the cottier system, supporting a very cheap labour force, but also leading to lower living standards. A potato wage was common, symbolising the growing agricultural economy's reliance on this crop. Additionally, before the famine hit, about 1/3 of the potato harvest, or around 5 million short tons, was used to feed livestock. Before the destructive arrival of a disease known as blight, identified scientifically as Phytophthora infestans, there were only 2 major diseases troubling potato plants. These were known as dry rot or taint, and a viral disease commonly referred to as curl. Phytophthora infestans differs from regular fungi as it is actually an oomycete, which means it is more like a parasitic algae that does not photosynthesize. The census of Ireland commissioners in 1851 documented that, going back to 1728, there were 24 instances where the potato crops did not do well for various reasons. There were significant years when either disease or frost led to poor harvests, specifically in 1739, 1740, 1770, 1800, and 1807. Different regions in Ireland experienced crop failures at different times throughout the early 19th century, with notable losses due to dry rot and curl in the 1830s. Ireland faced multiple widespread failures in the years leading up to the devastating arrival of the potato blight. It was widely acknowledged in Ireland, as noted by Woodham Smith, that potatoes were not always reliable. The exact time and manner of blight's introduction to Europe are still subjects of speculation among experts. However, it is believed not to have been in Europe before 1842, possibly arriving around 1844. Its origins have been traced to the Toluca Valley in Mexico. The disease spread from North America to Europe, with the 1845 to 1846 blight in Europe being caused by a specific strain of the pathogen, known as Herb 1. In 1844, Irish newspapers were already reporting on a disease affecting potato crops in the eastern United States for 2 years. It is thought that blight may have come to Europe through potatoes carried on ships from the United States to feed passengers, a theory suggested by American plant pathologist William C. Paddock. Once in Ireland and the rest of Europe, the disease spread quickly. By mid-August 1845, it had impacted many parts of northern and central Europe, including Belgium, the Netherlands, northern France, and southern England. The first hints of the crisis in Europe were reported on the 16th of August 1845, and its devastating effects were rapidly acknowledged. Irish newspapers relayed the alarming news of the disease's spread and its impact on crops. Despite early optimism, by October, the British government realized the gravity of the situation when the extent of the crop destruction became clear. Initial estimates suggested a loss of 1/3 to 1/2 of the potato crop in 1845. The situation worsened in 1846, with 3/4 of the harvest lost to blight. The ensuing hardship led to widespread famine and death, as over 3 million Irish depended solely on potatoes for food. Even with average yields in 1847, the scarcity of seed potatoes meant that hunger persisted, and by 1848, the yields were still below normal, exacerbating the widespread hunger and famine in Ireland. The Corporation of Dublin reached out to the Queen with a request to convene Parliament earlier than scheduled. They were not seeking handouts. Instead, they proposed using public funds for infrastructure projects like railroads in Ireland to boost the economy. Similarly, Belfast's town council put forward comparable ideas, emphasising this was not about seeking charity, a sentiment echoed by John Mitchell, a significant figure in the repeal movement. In the early days of November 1845, Dublin's leading citizens, including notable figures like the Duke of Leinster and Daniel O'Connell, met with the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, Lord Heytesbury, to discuss potential solutions to the crisis. Their proposals included allowing foreign corn into Ireland, halting the distillation of grain to preserve food, banning the export of food items, and generating jobs through public projects. However, Lord Heytesbury advised calm, suggesting that their concerns were premature as experts were already examining these issues, and assured them that constant updates on the situation were being provided by certain officials. On December 8, 1845, Daniel O'Connell presented various strategies to avoid the looming crisis. He advocated for the introduction of tenant right, similar to what was in place in Ulster, to ensure fair rents and compensate tenants for their investments in land improvements. O'Connell highlighted Belgium's response to their own crop failure as a model, noting their decision to stop food exports and encourage imports. He argued that an autonomous Irish Parliament would have done the same, ensuring the local produce fed the Irish people and calling for the repeal of the Act of Union as the ultimate solution. John Mitchell later criticised the British government's role in the famine, intensifying the discourse around their policies with a powerful statement: "The Almighty, indeed, sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine." His outspoken views led to his arrest and sentencing under charges of sedition and later under the Treason Felony Act, resulting in his transportation to Bermuda. Charles Gavan Duffy pointed out that keeping locally produced food within Ireland until its people were fed was a strategy not only practiced by Europe, but also by Irish parliaments prior to the union with Great Britain. This period, known in Irish as An Drochshaol, or the Hard Time, signifies a specific era marked by the potato blight and has been remembered thus ever since. The years from 1845 to 1851 were not only defined by agricultural disaster, but were also a time of political turmoil. The Young Ireland movement, seeking more radical change, broke away from the primary repeal movement and even attempted an armed rebellion in 1848, which did not succeed. William Smith O'Brien, a leader within Young Ireland, was instrumental in founding the Irish Confederation to further push for the repeal of the Act of Union and advocated for measures like stopping grain exports to address the crisis, contributing to the complex landscape of Irish history during the famine. Historian Cecil Woodham Smith explained in her book titled The Great Hunger, Ireland 1845 to 1849, that one of the main reasons for the strained relationship between England and Ireland was because, despite Ireland's famine, large amounts of food were still being sent from Ireland to England. Even though maize was imported into Ireland, the country exported 4 times as much wheat at the famine's peak. Woodham Smith also mentioned that, according to the 1838 Act, the workhouses were supposed to be funded by local property taxes, but in the hardest-hit areas, tenants couldn't afford rent, so landlords couldn't pay these taxes. The system depended on selling food, some of which was exported, to fund rents and workhouses. However, the scale of the famine overwhelmed the relief efforts provided by workhouses. Nicholas McEvoy, a parish priest in Kells, shared his dire observations in October 1845. He inspected the potato crop personally and found that most were ruined, with little hope for the remainder due to the rapid spread of disease. Despite the looming starvation, food was still being exported, which he saw as a critical failure to protect the Irish people. McEvoy urged Irishmen to act to preserve their remaining provisions and emphasized that the right to survive outweighs any property rights, highlighting the crisis's severity. James Donnelly, another historian, pointed out that the image of Irish people starving while their food was shipped away became a powerful symbol for nationalists during the famine. Despite increased grain imports after spring 1847, discussions about the famine have often been limited, focusing on national data rather than detailed regional or product-specific analysis. Historian F.S.L. Lyons described the British government's first steps in dealing with the early, less intense part of the famine as quick and pretty effective. When crop failure hit hard in November 1845, Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel acted fast. He secretly bought £100,000 worth of maize and cornmeal from America, using the Baring brothers as his go-betweens, hoping this move would boost efforts without stepping on the toes of private businesses or local relief initiatives. Unfortunately, due to bad weather, this crucial aid didn't make it to Ireland until February 1846. What's more, the shipments consisted of unprocessed dried kernels, and there were hardly any mills in Ireland that could handle maize. This meant a lengthy and difficult milling process was needed before the cornmeal could even be distributed. Plus, before anyone could safely eat it, the cornmeal had to be cooked thoroughly. Otherwise, it could cause serious stomach issues. Because of its yellow colour and lack of popularity at first, it was nicknamed Peel's Brimstone. In October of the same year, Peel tried to get rid of the Corn Laws, which were import tariffs on grain that kept bread prices high. However, this issue caused a rift in his party, and he didn't have enough support from his peers to see it through. He stepped down as Prime Minister in December, but when the opposition couldn't get its act together to form a government, he was put back in charge. By March, Peel had launched a public works programme in Ireland in an effort to combat the growing famine crisis. Yet the famine intensified through 1846, and repealing the Corn Laws that year sadly didn't do much to relieve the suffering Irish. This move even ended up splitting Peel's Conservative Party, which led to his government's downfall. On June 25th, Peel's government faced another setback when it lost by 73 votes on the second reading of its Irish Coercion Bill in the House of Commons, defeated by an alliance of Whigs, Radicals, Irish Repealers, and Protectionist Conservatives. Just a few days later, on June 29th, Peel had no choice but to resign as Prime Minister, paving the way for Whig leader Lord John Russell to take over. As the crisis in Ireland deepened, the approach taken by the new leader following Peel, named Russell, just did not cut it. Russell's team, who were big believers in allowing the market to handle things, thought it was better not to interfere with food going to England and stop the relief work that was previously set up. This left countless individuals without jobs, cash, or food. They did attempt to start some new public works by the end of 1846, getting 500,000 people employed, but it turned out to be a huge challenge to manage. Charles Trevelyan, the individual overseeing the government's relief efforts, cut back on the food aid, arguing that once these public works paid out wages, people would buy food, thereby encouraging imports into Ireland. He disturbingly remarked that the famine was a divine lesson for the Irish, implying it should not be eased too much. The problem, he said, was not the famine itself, but the supposed poor qualities of the Irish people. In private, Trevelyan actually saw a silver lining for the English in the famine, suggesting it would lead to changes in Irish land ownership that were, in his view, desirable. By January 1847, the government realised its hands-off policy was a failure and shifted to a mix of direct relief, both indoor through workhouses and outdoor through soup kitchens, charging the cost to local landlords who in turn sometimes evicted tenants or pushed them towards conversion for relief, known as superism. In a twist, the Bank of England attempted to raise £14 million in March 1847 to aid Ireland and cut taxes, which led to a financial scare as gold was pulled back, shrinking the money supply. And by April, with reserves down, it was announced famine relief costs would be covered by local taxes in Ireland, yet real aid did not follow through as hoped. Come June 1847, the Poor Law Amendment Act passed, embodying the idea that Irish property should handle Irish poverty. British landowners were blamed for creating famine conditions, but the Illustrated London News pointed out that the British Parliament post-1800 Union Act was also complicit. The Times matched this sentiment, criticising Britain for allowing such despair in Ireland. A notable part of the Poor Law, the Gregory Clause, basically stated that if you owned even a tiny piece of land, you would not qualify for outside relief, forcing many to give up their land to qualify for help. This led to a system where attempting to work the land could turn a person into a pauper. This, along with other pressures, forced tens of thousands off their lands in the late 1840s. In 1849, the Encumbered Estates Act allowed these debt-ridden lands to be sold cheap to wealthy British folks, who then raised rents or evicted tenants, making way for cattle grazing. This led to around 50,000 families getting evicted between 1849 and 1854. Landlords were tasked with covering the local taxes for any tenant paying an annual rent of £4 or less. This led landlords with many poor tenants to face significant expenses. To reduce these costs, many landlords started evicting poorer tenants, preferring to rent out larger pieces of land at higher rates. While some evictions occurred in 1846, a significant increase in evictions was recorded in 1847. However, tracking the exact number of evictions during the famine and its aftermath is challenging, as police only started recording evictions in 1849, documenting almost 250,000 people evicted from 1849 to 1854. This number is considered an underestimate by historian James S. Donnelly, Jr., who suggests the real figure might exceed 500,000 when including those who volunteered to leave under pressure. Helen Lytton indicates that these so-called voluntary surrenders were far from willing, with tenants often leaving under the false belief they would be welcomed into workhouses. West Clare and County Mayo were notably harsh when it came to evictions, with thousands of families forced out. Captain Kennedy noted that in West Clare, around 1,000 homes were destroyed from November to April 1848, affecting an average of 6 people each. Landlords like the Mayon family and George Bingham, 3rd Earl of Lucan, were particularly notorious for evicting thousands, with Lucan openly stating his unwillingness to support the poor, transforming the land for grazing instead. Bishop Thomas Nulty vividly described the trauma of witnessing 700 people being evicted in one day, highlighting the widespread suffering and death that followed these mass evictions. The population drops in areas like Drumbaragh and Springville and County Meath were staggering, with decreases up to 67% from 1841 to 1851. Lytton also pointed out the role of secret societies in initially deterring evictions, though their influence waned during the famine. The period saw violent reprisals, including the assassination of landlords. Major Dennis Mahon's killing in West Roscommon after evicting thousands underscored the desperation and anger of the population. The government's response to the violence and unrest, including the passing of the Crime and Outrage Act and the introduction of the controversial Gregory Clause to the Poor Law, reflected the tension between landowners and tenants. The Gregory Clause, in particular, was criticized for exacerbating the crisis, essentially acting as a tool for landlords to clear estates under the guise of poor relief reform. This period illustrates a tragic chapter in Irish history, marked by significant suffering and displacement. When it comes to helping out during the Irish famine, people really came together from around the globe, donating a stunning total of around £1,500,000, with £856,500 of that coming from outside Ireland. Within Ireland, it's a bit trickier to track down all the donations, but officially, people donated about £380,000, and once you consider the informal contributions, the total from Ireland likely topped that of Britain's £525,000. It's important to note that many people of Irish heritage living abroad also pitched in, with their donations counted in the regions they were made. Notably, English Protestants were among the top contributors outside Ireland. The generosity kicked off with campaigns as early as December 1845, seeing groups like the Boston Repeal Association and the Catholic Church opening their wallets. Calcutta made headlines with a hefty donation of about £14,000 in 1846, thanks to contributions from Irish soldiers and folks working for the East India Company there. Even Tsar Alexander II of Russia and Queen Victoria, who donated £2,000, got in on the act. There's an interesting tale about Sultan Abdulmajid I of the Ottoman Empire, initially offering £10,000 but then reducing it to £1,000, reportedly to avoid outdoing the Queen. Across the pond, U.S. President James K. Polk contributed $50, and Abraham Lincoln, at the time a congressman, chipped in with $10, a sum worth $307 today. Pope Pius IX didn't just donate a sizable 1,000 scudi, about £213, but also used his influence to rally support, issuing the encyclical Predecessors Nostros in March 1847 to drum up global Catholic support. Fundraising efforts spanned continents, with contributions coming from as far as Venezuela, Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Russia, and Italy. Beyond the faith-based support, secular organisations like the British Relief Association, formed by Lionel de Rothschild, Abel Smith and others, made significant strides in gathering funds across England, America and Australia, partly fueled by appeals from Queen Victoria herself. This association alone managed to raise approximately £390,000 for the cause. Private groups like the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, stepped up too, especially when government relief wound down, showing just how much individuals could make a difference. The contributions from the United States were especially noteworthy, with Senator Henry Clay emphasizing the profound impact of these acts of charity. Americans sent over 118 ships loaded with relief goods worth $545,145, showcasing a remarkable unity across states and religious lines. South Carolina and Pennsylvania stood out for their efforts, with Pennsylvania being a major hub for famine relief efforts in the U.S. Groups ranging from Catholics to Jews came together in a wonderful show of solidarity. Even the Native American Choctaw Nation, having faced their own hardships not long before, gathered $170, now valued at around $5,218, in 1847 to aid Ireland, a gesture of incredible empathy and kindness that remains celebrated to this day. Indeed, the response to the Irish famine was a powerful testament to the spirit of international cooperation and compassion, bridging divides and bringing together people from all walks of life to support those in need. It's believed that the famine led to over 1 million people leaving Ireland, with around 1 million heading far, mainly to North America, from 1846 to 1851. The 1851 census records nearly 968,000 of these long-distance travelers, plus possibly more than 200,000 who moved a shorter distance, mainly to Britain. The famine significantly boosted emigration rates from Ireland by as much as 45% to 85% in different years and counties, but people had been leaving Ireland long before the famine started. The trend of mass emigration really kicked off in the mid-18th century, with about 250,000 people heading to the New World over 50 years. Cormac O'Grada, an Irish economist, estimates between 1 and 1.5 million left between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and the start of the Great Famine in 1845. During the peak of the famine, about 250,000 left in 1 year, especially from the west of Ireland. Unlike other mass migrations throughout history, entire families often didn't move together. Instead, it was usually the younger family members who left, making emigration almost a coming-of-age ritual. Remarkably, women were leaving just as frequently and in the same numbers as men. The money these emigrants sent back home, £1,404,000 by 1851, helped others in their family to emigrate as well. During the famine from 1845 to 1850, people primarily escaped to England, Scotland, South Wales, North America and Australia. The McCorkle line was popular among those heading to the Americas. Liverpool in particular saw a huge Irish influx, with Irish-born people making up at least a quarter of its population by 1851. This changed the city's character significantly, earning it the nickname Ireland's second capital. T.P. O'Connor, an Irish nationalist, was even elected to Parliament there in 1885, a seat he held until his death in 1929. Today, it's estimated that 3/4 of Liverpool's population has Irish roots. The journey to Canada was especially perilous in 1847, with about 20% of the more than 100,000 Irish emigrants dying from disease and malnutrition. Over 5,000 died at Gros Isle, Quebec alone. The ships, often overcrowded and in poor condition, sailed from small, unregulated Irish ports, leading to high death rates. In that year, 38,000 Irish arrived in Toronto, a city of less than 20,000, making more than half its population Irish. Many other Canadian cities saw significant Irish arrivals too. By 1871, 55% of St. John's population were Irish or of Irish descent. Canada, being part of the British Empire, couldn't close its ports to these ships, allowing for inexpensive passage. In America, most Irish immigrants settled in cities, as they lacked the funds to move elsewhere. By 1850, they constituted a quarter of the populations in cities like Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The famine wasn't just a tragedy of immense human suffering. It sparked a profound depopulation of Ireland throughout the 19th century. While the population had been growing by the 1830s, the problem in Ireland was recognized not as one of overpopulation, but rather as a lack of capital investment. Between 1831 and 1841, the population increased by 5%. But by 1854, devastatingly, between 1.5 to 2 million had left due to evictions, starvation, and dire living conditions. The tragic period of the Irish famine remains a time of immense loss and suffering, with the exact number of deaths still unclear. Many believe that disease claimed more lives than starvation did. Since there was no state system to record births, marriages, or deaths at that time, and Catholic Church records are incomplete, estimating the number of deaths is challenging. However, by comparing population expectations, it's estimated that the numbers fell significantly in the 1950s. In 1841, Ireland's population was over 8.17 million, but by 1851 it had dropped to 6.55 million, more than a 1.5 million decrease in just 10 years. If the famine hadn't occurred, the population was expected to be over 9 million by 1851. The University College Cork Geography Department's Great Irish Famine online project suggests even before the famine, the population might have exceeded 8.75 million. The 1851 census, which tried to track mortality since 1841, recorded 21,770 deaths from starvation and over 400,000 from diseases like fever, diphtheria, and cholera, indicating that many families and entire villages were lost to disease. Later research confirms that these early death counts likely underestimated the true impact. Historians and specialists propose numbers ranging from 775,000 to as high as 1.5 million deaths, mainly from disease. The consensus among modern scholars leans towards an estimate of around 1 million deaths. Detailed records now allow for a better understanding of Ireland's demographic changes since 1841. The famine brought about widespread disease, with the malnourished particularly susceptible to infections. Diseases related to poor nutrition, like starvation, marasmus, and dropsy, now understood to include conditions like kwashiorkor, were rampant. However, it was the famine-induced diseases that were the deadliest, exacerbated by overcrowding and poor sanitary conditions. Malnutrition severely weakened the population's resistance to diseases such as measles, tuberculosis, and particularly fever, which caused the highest mortality. Cholera, arriving in 1849, further devastated those already weakened by famine, ultimately reducing Ireland's population by an estimated 20 to 25%. This period not only marks a profound demographic shift, but also provides a crucial lens into the medical history of the Great Famine, illustrating the deadly interplay between malnutrition, disease, and social conditions of the time. Back in 1830, Ireland saw its women getting married at an average age of 23.8 and men at 27.5, a slight increase from earlier times when women married at 21 and men at 25. Interestingly, about 10% of the population never got married. This trend continued with the average marriage age creeping up. By 1840, women were marrying at 24.4 years old and men at 27.7 years old. Post-famine, these numbers jumped significantly to 28 to 29 years for women and 33 years for men. Economic hardships contributed to as many as 1/3 of Irish men and 1/4 of Irish women choosing not to marry at all. The tough times also led some young women, including famine orphans, to turn to prostitution, notably among those known as the Wrens of the Curragh. By the time the potato blight made a comeback in 1879, Ireland was in the thick of the Land War, a major agrarian protest led by Michael David, a figure shaped by his family's eviction during his childhood. This movement, notable for its scale in a 19th century Europe, involved boycotting landlords and physically preventing evictions, though the government cracked down on it hard, interning nearly 1,000 people at one point. However, these actions, along with improved conditions and increased solidarity, helped mitigate the effects of the subsequent famine. Linguist Eric Falcher-Poirou pointed out that despite Ireland's rich musical traditions, very few folk songs dealing with the Great Famine and its aftermath exist. This scarcity is likely because broaching the subject revived painful memories for the poorer classes. Additionally, many songs from that period, especially those in Irish, didn't survive. Collectors often ignored them, deeming the language and its speakers lower class. Skibbereen is among the rare exceptions that remain known today. However, emigration has proven a rich vein for Irish songs throughout the 20th century, reflecting a shift in the narrative and sources of inspiration for Irish music. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.